Shalom uvracha. Hello everyone, and welcome to the first ever edition of the Tzarich Iyun podcast. Tzarich Iyun is a Charedi intellectual journal. Yes, such a thing does exist. I had the pleasure and the merit of founding this some 4 years ago or so in the Hebrew language. Since then, we've developed into an English language version also. And the idea of Tzarich Iyun is, as it reads, Tzarich Iyun requires investigation. It tries to thrash out, to think about, in a reflective way, in an analytical way, issues that are relevant to Charedi society. Whether those issues are internal, the internal mechanisms, function, issues that arise, whether it's because we're Charedim or whether it's because we're Charedim in interaction with a bunch of other people, other systems, other states and governments and so on, Israel, America, the rest of the world. There's a lot to speak about. And it also requires, it also has a connotation of Tzarich Iyun, a certain difficulty. We are in times that raise difficulties, that raise a number of issues that weren't around in the past. And therefore we believe that there's a real need to think, to thrash these issues out and to be more aware of them. And once we're more aware, we can also reach better decision making in going towards the future. That's the idea. This podcast grew out of that. It's an English language podcast because we believe there's a real need for English language content in this area, in this field. And my partner in crime, if you want, for this podcast is a very close friend and colleague, Rabbis Pfeffer and Adlerstein. Rabbis Pfeffer, Shalom Aleichem.
Great to be here.
Yeah, Mir Tashem, we should have a lot of Siyata Dishmai. Maybe give a few words of who you are and why this is important in your eyes.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that you started off immediately with an oxymoron. Put a microphone in front of a rabbi and there's never such a thing as a few words. But be that as it may, where the two of us differ is that you've been here a lot longer than I have. So I'm kind of the new vintage American Ole who still hasn't learned to put American cultural ways behind him. I am, in my professional capacity, the director of interfaith affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, happens to be the largest Jewish membership organization in North America, perhaps the world. In other parts of my Klal work, I was one of the editors of Klal Perspectives.
Of blessed memory.
Currently comatose, but the doctors have not given up and we're not pulling the plug yet. We'll come back to that some other time. Klal Perspectives was an online journal addressed to the entire Orthodox world, or the more traditional half of the Orthodox world, in the English, certainly in America in particular, but we had many, many readers in Israel as well. What we found about Klal Perspectives, of all the kudos that we got and the criticism that we got, it was popular because we were contributing something that wasn't there so much in America, and indeed, if you look back, has not always been there in the Orthodox world in recent memory, or not so recent memory, and that is assembling perspectives, plural, under one roof. The very idea that you could have different points of view by B'nai Torah, sometimes by Choshev Rabbanim, was something that was intensely liberating to many listeners who were tired of being pigeonholed or painted into a corner. This is the way you have to think because this is part of orthodoxy. As somebody who worked in the Kiruv world for many decades, I know that some of those boxes proved to be too narrow for many people, and it cost us nefashos. But even within Unzura, within our own, the fact that it had to be a certain way, and you have to think a certain way, it is something that was so stultifying to people that when they found out that people can disagree and they can have a collegial conversation with each other, was something that was very positive. You know, I had a radio program for a couple of years with a colleague of mine, also from a very different part of Orthodoxy. And our byline was 2 rabbis, 3 opinions. And
nice.
Yeah, and
nice.
I
think we'll try to make it 4.
I was about to say we're reading each other's minds. My other primary. That's not contradiction. My other objective here is something that we often don't like speaking about, and I'm sure this will become a theme in future podcasts. I was a devoted Talmud of Rav Nachman Bullman Zatzal. He's one of the people who really shaped my past, and he had a catchy phrase that he was fond of using, at least when the mic was off. He accused our generation of suffering from tzimtzum hamochos. Not the tzimtzum that you'll find in the Orach Chaim on Bereshis, a different kind of tzimtzum. When you box people into a corner, you suppress creativity. And if there was ever a time that we needed creative thought, it was today, when challenges come past us faster than any time in history. Every generation has said it can't get any worse, and this is the worst time in history. But there sometimes are objective things that you can say. One of the things that has traction about what makes our generation different is that the rate of change is such that our own community doesn't seem to be capable of really keeping up and catching up with all the new things that are there. So where are you coming from, Yoshua?
Well, first of all, I identify with most of what you say, and it's a privilege to have you on as a partner because, reason is a great source of knowledge, but experience is probably no less and probably much better source of knowledge. So it's really a privilege to be able to work together on this show. I think number one, what the second point that you made, just thinking. I think often we're used to not thinking, and that can work. I'm not saying necessarily that a system that doesn't encourage thought can't work. Haredi society, I think that Soloveitchik used this in his famous article, is a mimetic style of upbringing, of knowing, of living, and mimetic in the sense the Greek, it means something like copying, but the idea is that you carry on the tradition from generation to generation. What did your forefathers do? What did you do traditionally? And you continue that on. And that's worked pretty well. But the trouble is, if you don't know how to articulate what it is that you stand for, if you don't know how to think in a reflective way also about what are your basic ideals, what are your basic assumptions in terms of morality, in terms of religion, in terms of the priorities of life and so on, then when you encounter other systems, when you go out into the world and you no longer live in that very uniform, very isolated ghetto, then you're in trouble. And I think that today, Haredi society can't be as isolated as it was in the past. We can argue, and we probably will. Is that good? Is that bad? That's maybe for the future. But it's a fact. And the fact is that so many people are going out, whether because of internet exposure, whether because they're going out into the workforce, whether because they're in some academic institution, whatever it is, and they're exposed to so many bodies of knowledge, to so many other alternatives in terms of ways of life, in terms of culture, in terms of everything. So they have to know what do we stand for. And that requires thought. It requires thinking. It requires also, like you said, a range of opinions and a crystallization to clarify. So that's the first thing, I think. But I think that if we're speaking about English language, and one of the things I do here is I'm a community rav of an English language community here in Yerushalayim, in Ramot. And our assumptions, our background are somewhat different to what we have as the kind of mainstream assumptions of Haredi Judaism in Eretz Israel. And I think that that's why, whether you're an Anglo living here or whether you're living abroad, Eretz Israel is a center. It's a center of Torah. It's Kimitzia in Teitzei Torah. It's a wonderful lighthouse whether for Israel, for the rest of the world. And yet, I think that specifically as Anglos, we can have a perspective that can contribute a lot. Often it's the immigrants that are able to, number one, provide the most eloquent articulations because they have a broader vision, they have a broader perspective. They also sometimes have tools that those on the inside don't have. Think about, in terms of Haredi society, the Boyas and with Uriel Zimmer. He was one of the most articulate of those who tried to explain what it is that we stand for. This is going back to the 60s. But Yeki, of course, who came in from the outside, as Boya was. And even today, that perspective, as well as assumptions that can be slightly different to what the Eretz Yisrael society is used to, I think can be just, number one, a wonderful proliferation. And number two, it's just very important for us to sharpen our own kind of intuitions, perspectives, understandings. And if there's I think that's a good reason for why we're here.
One of my favorite shmuzin of Rav Chaim Shmulevitz is about the medrash about how Esav finally lost his head. And at the Kvura of Yaakov Avinu, where he tried to block their entrance into Maras HaMachpelah and said, "What are you guys doing here?" And he said, "We own it." "No, I own it." He said, "Well, we own it." "Yeah, I'm a reasonable guy. You have any proof?" "Yeah, we have a star. We got the documentation." "Okay, where is it?" "Well, it's back in Egypt." "Oh, no. Well, I'll wait. I'm not in any hurry." So they send Naphtali, the runner, back. And what happens? Chushim ben Dan sees what's going on, takes out his sword and lops off Esav's head, which rolls into Maras HaMachpelah because he did have a good head, which might be a good commentary on the perils of a show like this. It can't be just intellectual. We have to remember that we have to be grounded in other things as well. Anyway, Rav Chaim Shmulevitz says, why Chushim ben Dan? Why was he the one? Well, the other thing we know about Chushim ben Dan is that he was deaf. And he says, sometimes when you're in the midst of something, when you're enmeshed in a situation or in a culture, you take everything about that seriously enough that you have to respond to it, even if it's ridiculous. Chushim ben Dan sees his grandfather lying in the hot sun. They've just made a trip of considerable length, and this guy appears out of nowhere and is trying to block them. So he takes out his sword and lops it off. He did objectively what the proper thing was to do. The others were negotiating, because when you're in the midst of something, you have no other choice. And I think that's where I come in and some Anglos come in. And up until very, very recently, any Charedi looking to make Aliyah was told, listen, don't try to change the world or even to try to change your family. You've got to make a binary decision. You're either going to be with the Dati Leumi world in Israel or the Charedi world. Neither is perfect. Make your choice. And then you and your kids had a series of expectations that would determine where they were going to be for the rest of their lives.
And where you'll be also.
And where you'll be as well. And I think that is beginning to change a little. At least I hope. I'm still a naive Anglo.
I would just add to that. It's not just that they're being told they have to make a binary decision. Often they were being told, just don't come. And unfortunately, I was witness to several instances in which different Rebbeim of mine who were asked to consult, who were consulted with about making Aliyah, and they were told, you know what you're looking for is going to be hard to find. And in terms of chinuch, the chances are that things are going to go wrong. And, I say this with a wry smile, but it's really somewhat tragic. It's really, one of the problems that we really need to address here is the issue of chinuch, is the issue of where we as Anglos and our friends, of course, find ourselves here in Eretz Yisrael, and how to make that binary decision a little bit less binary and a little bit more palatable, because it's not like we don't have a good tradition in Chutz La'aretz also. Chutz La'aretz is actually a very traditional place, sometimes more than Eretz Yisrael. I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to speak about, conservatism versus the more future-minded, progressive-minded versions of Judaism, but those exist within Haredi society also. It's not always a question of whether you're Reform or whether you're observant. Among Poskim, you find that the real traditionalists, Rav Shmuel Vosner, for example, super traditional, a Rav of once upon a time. Rav Elyashiv was not a big traditionalist. Rav Yosef Shalom Elyashiv, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, he had tremendous chidushim. Sometimes he blamed them on Minig Yerushalayim, but other times he just said them. And I think that, we have something to contribute also. I don't think we'll be chopping any heads off. I hope not. I don't think that's necessarily the way forwards. But certainly in conversation, and in a conversation that also has real ramifications. Like you said, in terms of chinuch, in terms of community, in terms of understanding, in terms of, where the next generation is going to be.
I'm hopeful that in the coming episodes of this podcast, some of the people who are figuring in some of the changes, if you want to call them that, grace notes, if you don't want to call them that, some of those players will come on to our show and help our listenership understand some of the real options that are developing, both in making binary a drop less binary and offering opportunities for chinuch in particular at a time that many in the West see themselves as witnessing the final years or decades of a civilization and are very seriously making plans for Aliyah and still facing what they think is a brick wall, which is no longer a brick wall. It's becoming more of let's say, plastic slats.
Well, I'll tell you something interesting in that context. Many people ask me, in the context of Tzarich Iyun and some of the other things that I do, and they say, Rabbi Pfeffer, you're a conservative person, you're a Brit, you claim to be in the conservative kind of milieu on that side of the map, but surely all these things that you're doing seem to be pretty new. They seem to be pretty innovative. They're taking us to a different place, surely. So how do these things go together? How are you on the one side a conservative and on the other side doing all these new things? And the way I see it is very much like you mentioned now, that the change is happening irrespective of, and with respect, Yoshua Pfeffer, Rabbi Adlerstein, that the change is happening from the field. It's happening in any case. That's the fact of the matter. The question isn't how to create change. I think the question really is how to conserve. How to conserve in the face of change, in the face of new realities that force us to rethink, and whether we like it or not. And if we're not able to rethink, if we're not able to try to adopt our core values the core values to this new reality, to the new circumstances, then we're going to lose it. And I think Dafka here, specifically here, the Anglos have something to offer, because their model is a model that has this balance, right? For us, it's not a grave sin if you go to work, chas v'shalom, and several other issues that we'll be raising over the course of the podcast. And perhaps this kind of balance from a place of tradition, from a place is, yes, this is what our parents and grandparents did. And true, in Eretz Yisrael, the model is somewhat different. But nonetheless, when the Israelis are searching for balance, then maybe they can find something specifically here with the Anglos, with the English-speaking community, because it's hard for them to do it. Often they're in a state of confusion. They've been brought up in a different way than they might be living today, and therefore that causes a certain friction, even tension. And thank you. And therefore, the Anglos don't have that friction. They don't have that tension. Maybe they have something real to contribute here.
Yeah, we're not going to minimize all the problems that Anglos have had, continue to have, and in many senses, an erosion of values with that came concomitantly with the growth of number of people who were adhering to Torah and to Limud Torah. A certain kind of superficiality that crept in, and a lack of drive and motivation for real change in ruchnius, and I'm sure we're going to get to that too. You're so right about what you said. Conservatism that doesn't allow for any method of change is doomed to failure, to ossify itself and bury itself within a few years. There's a reason why in the United States they don't talk about conservatives, they talk about neocons, because conservatism had to kind of reinvent itself, and that was a good few decades ago. I don't know what new title they're going to come up with in the next few years. There was a Rav in Tel Aviv, his name escapes me at the moment, said, if we asked, as we did, our Talmidim in the past, where is there a mitzvah in the Torah of studying history? So we'd eventually tease out a response of Shala, Vicha, V'yagetcha. He said, don't forget what comes after that. Binu shenos dor v'ador, which he said means not only understand the course of different generations, but the shinui, shnos dor v'ador. Understand when parts of the past have to change because conditions have changed. And that's where we're all looking for the right balance between change and tradition. If you're talking about influence of Anglos, potential influence of Anglos because of parts of their successful model, we have to remember that the only reason that it was successful in the United States is because people were looking over their shoulders for firm anchoring in the more traditional communities in Eretz Yisrael. Without that, I'm reminded of a question that was posed to Rav Kook at the heyday of his power. And he was suffering terribly from the Kanoim. And he had the power to squelch them. And they asked him, why don't you quash these people who are causing you such akmas nefesh? And he said, Chas v'shalom, we're like a ship at sea. If we don't have them to anchor us, there's no telling where we will drift off to.
Reminds me of Rav Shach. Rav Shach said the same thing about the Satmar Rebbe. Each one takes it one step to the right. At his hesped for the Satmar Rebbe, so he said, yes, we don't always agree on issues of policy, and there's daylight between us, but without him, where would we be? So, so each one takes it one step to the right. And I don't think it's necessarily mean right and left are binary ideas that I think we'll try to flesh out in a more nuanced way. It's not all about right and left over here. Going to work, for example, isn't a left-wing agenda. It's a Torah agenda. It's a Gadol Hanene Migia Kapov agenda, just for instance. But, although this is a very nice introduction and we're agreeing so nicely on everything, I'd like to try to let's try to find a point of disagreement. And I'd like to ask...
That won't be hard.
That won't be hard? So let's do it. But what's your take on the Israel diaspora relations within Haredi society or Jewish society generally? You're more newly arrived, as you mentioned. I've been here for, it seems to me, forever, since I was a young yeshiva guy. That ended up staying in Israel and learning many years, and here I am. But you've spent your life in United States and the diaspora. How do you see that? How do you see the relationship? Where's it going?
You mean of the Haredi community in particular, not of American Jewry versus Israeli Jewry?
Yes.
Funny you should ask that. It's been, as I said, something that's very positive, as I mentioned a moment ago, and I would add to that much of the personal engine of many, if not most Haredim in the United States came from the years that they spent living in a more rarefied spiritual atmosphere of Eretz Yisrael, away from the materialism, in a place where people took davening a little bit more seriously and where you were surrounded by people whose life was limud Torah and didn't cut any corners. Not that, I shouldn't say didn't cut any corners. In America, I believe most of us don't consciously cut corners as well. But it was such an important contribution that the Haredi society in Israel made to us, and it's going to increase because right now there are more Jews living in Eretz Yisrael than there are in America, and it may be that in a decade or so it'll be the majority of Jews around the world. That said, there were parts of it which were not so healthy. I'm really an old timer. I remember Rav Moshe. Not only the power of what he wrote and how important he was in halacha and how everyone went to Rav Moshe. I remember Rav Yaakov Zatzal as well. I wasn't a Talmud of both, but I knew both personally and had the zchus of spending time at formative moments in my life with both of them. They died within a month of each other. There was something that was terribly upsetting by that. Many of us felt that. I
remember that, Tira. Meaning, I was a young school kid, but I remember that vividly. It was a real, it was a wretched time. It was so difficult to absorb that.
I remember one of my Rebbeim, Rav Peretz Steinberg Shlita, was a Rav in Queens and a product both of Beis Medrash Gavoa and Beis Medrash Elyon, and very, very close with Moshe. And definitely a complete traditionalist. But I remember speaking to him after and saying, like, what's going to be? Like, where is the rising Shemesh that's going to replace the old one? And he said, it can't happen. It's not going to be. So I thought he was just acting in sorrow. I asked him 20 years later, have you revisited what's replaced it? He said, nope. Huh. He didn't change. I thought that some things had, that there was a flowering within the realm of halacha.
But was he referring specifically to the United States?
No, he meant the world.
He meant globally.
He meant globally. And there's been such a proliferation of quality Torah, both in more narrow parts of halacha. There's been a specialization and amazing Torah journals and Chiddush and halacha as well. That what started off as the province of one individual or a small group of individuals has now, the labor has been spread out. There's something satisfying and unsatisfying about that. But let me not distract myself from my main point. People were wondering what's going to happen now that we don't have Rav Moshe and Rav Yaakov. There's kind of like an informal separation of powers between the two. Rav Moshe was the yesod of halacha, but Rav Yaakov was much more the one you went to for eitzah and guidance and penetrating analysis of where this is going. He was Machabed Rav Moshe. I remember sitting in his living room and seeing a picture of him and Rav Moshe on the mantle of his fireplace with Rav Moshe up front and him standing behind. That was an important statement of his anava and of some of the separation of powers in America at the time. What's going to happen now? We don't have Rav Moshe, we don't have Rav Yaakov. And within a matter of months, there were people who went to Rav Shach and said, you're the new manig of America. And Rav Shach said, can't be. It's a different culture. I'm thousands of miles away. You've got to find people on your own turf. And they said, no, we have no one in America. And Rav Shach says, you have to find. And they said, no. And Rav Shach refused for about 6 months. That's the way I recall it. Until they badgered him and said, the people of America want you to be the manig. They're demanding it, so you have to be. There was a decision made then that there was no real first-rate hanhaga left in America. Everything is second-rate, and we're going to ask all questions now in Yerushalayim or Bnei Brak, depending on which part of the Haredi world you were coming from. I think that was one of the most dangerous decisions that American Jewry
Would you say that's still a situation today?
I would say that is still for a large part, it's the situation today. We have developed some people who the Olam respects. No one of the majesty of the cadre of Rav Moshe and Rav Yaakov, who everybody looked up to. We don't have those unifying figures. But we have people that subgroups of the community did look up to. But in terms of Hanaga, look, it sometimes got to the point. I remember in my shul in Los Angeles, a shul I davened. It wasn't my shul, but I davened with Rav Gershon Best Shlita for close to 40 years. And somebody put up a sign in the back announcing a new shiur once a week in Lashon Hara. Right? It sounds pretty tame innocuous,
pretty
right?
innocuous.
At the bottom was a legend I've seen again and again and again. This shiur has the approval and support of Gedolei Yisrael.
Wow.
Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that you have a community that is being told that there's a certain amount of loyalty to those on top, dafka those on top, who have to be gone to for every question.
Meaning a very centralized system, a very centralized authority.
System, which means that much of the bottom-up way of attending to needs of the community that was part of our community for hundreds of years.
Right, which is a more federal model, though, because you need to have local authorities, local powers, local rabbanim. I have my eye on the clock, so we're gonna have to finish in a minute. But just in reaction, I think a similar process is happening in Eretz Yisrael, meaning the kind of centralized authority that we had in the times of Rav Shach, for example, is not around today anymore. It's much more splintered. It's much more, fractured in that sense. And it will be interesting to see to what degree your assertion that, that situation is still ongoing today will really be able to continue into the years to come, when I'm assuming that this more decentralizing kind of dynamic will continue also here in Eretz Yisrael. That'll be interesting to see.
If we take our gloves off and we both have a couple of shots to drink before we come on, and we analyze the reactions of different communities and different parts of the community to COVID, I think we'll come up with some very interesting material. And I'll be surprised if we agree about all points, and I'll be surprised if we disagree about all of them.
Me too. And COVID is certainly something that we'll speak about. I think the COVID question certainly brought into focus the advantages and the disadvantages of the deeply centralized model, and where it takes us. In terms of Eretz Yisrael and the diaspora, just to give my 2 cents on that, I think that for many years, the assumption was a kind of Yisachar Zvulun arrangement. All right? America is the Zvulun, they're the providers, and Eretz Yisrael is the Yisachar. And by the way, that's a kind of expansion and extension of the traditional Chalukah model. Eretz Yisrael is a place where people learn, where people dedicate themselves to Avodas Hashem. Chutz La'aretz supports Eretz Yisrael because they're not self-reliant and therefore they need the support. I'm not sure if that's going to be the future of the relationship. I think that there are already, no small or no few cracks in that model for a variety of reasons, and from both sides of the equation. And I think that'll be fascinating to see how that plays out. The other thing is the question of Aliyah. If you mentioned COVID, we're also on the verge of real change in terms of American politics, and who knows how that might be able to influence the rate of Aliyah. Certainly, I've had conversations recently with Nefesh B'Nefesh. They're expecting a real flood, a real new intake of Olim from Western Europe and from the United States, English-speaking countries. I think that could make a big difference too.
Indeed. I'll only add that since I have the mic, one of my
closing statement, closing statement.
Closing statement is that the interplay is not just in one direction. Because the Charedi community here in Eretz Yisrael has had and continues to have such impact, it has to be, I believe, more conscious of what actions here are going to what consequences those actions are going to have on Jews in America. When communities decided to go their own and ignore COVID policies of the health ministry, did they stop to think that there are going to be people, hundreds of thousands in the United States, looking to their cousins in Eretz Yisrael, saying, if they can do that, we can do that too, even though they're living under the watchful gaze of Western journalists?
Well, some of them, if you do that, we can do that too. And others, what on earth are you doing? How on earth can this be a representation of Torah Judaism? How does this look to the outside world? And everyone's seeing it. And this is really a development of the last couple of decades because of the new media, because of the new internet technologies. Everything's exposed. You can't play double speak. You can't talk in one language internally and speak another one when you're talking to your friends across the pond.
Only the PA gets to do that.
Okay, we'll wrap up for today. Thank you very much to all our listeners for joining us. It's been a pleasure. Mir Hashem will have some animated, some dynamic, and some fascinating conversations. I trust and hope that you'll be with us and that you'll enjoy and really be able to think through some of these crucial issues which are so relevant for the future of Klal Israel, of Haredi society, of all of us, of Israel and the diaspora. So thank you, Rav Yitzchak.
Thank you, Rabbi Shua.
Mir Hashem, see you soon.